Now let's look at those issues or those substances that regulate their reabsorption. And by regulating, what I mean by that is it's not a complete reabsorption, and that reabsorption can vary based on a number of different factors, okay? So what I would like to do now is we're going to do this video in two parts. We're going to do 3 substances in this video, and we'll do a couple other ones with acid-base balance in the next video. So let's look at here what I'm talking about. So in this chart that we're looking at right now, we've got sodium, we have water, potassium, bicarbonate paired with a hydrogen ion, and then we have calcium and then phosphate as the last 2. So I would like to cover these first 3 in this one. These are going to be big ones that I want to focus in on for this video. Okay, so what we want to do on this one, when I'm looking at this chart, I'm going to go through which ones are, or which locations are they reabsorbed in, whether it's the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, and collecting duct. So I have those in different areas, okay? So let's look at sodium first. Sodium is a substance that can be reabsorbed throughout the entire tubular system, okay? So we're looking at reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting tubules and ducts. That's where we're looking at this. Now, with sodium, nearly 100% of it is reabsorbed. 98 to 100% is reabsorbed, okay? Before we get into the specifics of that, let's go through where water and potassium is reabsorbed, and then we can do some notes on something else, because I don't have a whole lot of room on these tables and I'll get too crunched in right now, okay? Now, water is reabsorbed in your proximal convoluted tubule and in your nephron loop, but I'm going to put a little asterisk on this one because it's only part of the nephron loop, not the whole thing, okay? So the nephron loop is going to be a little squirrely in some of these things. It does not go through the distal convoluted tubule. That's going to be impermeable to water, and it can do to varying degrees in the collecting tubule and collecting duct. Potassium is going to be within the proximal convoluted tubule. It's going to be part of the loop as well as the collecting tubules and ducts, okay? We're going to do the bicarbonate and calcium and stuff a little bit later on this one. So the next thing I want to do is look at sodium a little bit more specific. That way we can kind of focus in on this one. So sodium does 98 to 100% is reabsorbed. So let me just write that here. 98 to 100% is reabsorbed in this case. Now we've said that it is reabsorbed in all the different segments, but now let's look at what percentages in each area. So the proximal convoluted tubule reabsorbs approximately 65%. The loop is 25%. Now that leaves the distal convoluted tubule, collecting tubule, and duct as a variable area. And it varies based on hormones. Okay, so let me just write varies, or the amount. I'll put amount varies on this one. And that covers both of those areas. Before we get into the hormones, let's look at how sodium is reabsorbed. Okay, so on this one, let's go down, and I think I have a picture here. Yeah, there we go. So let's look at this picture on here. This first picture, this is your proximal convoluted tubule, and this is your collecting tubule, collecting duct area. Okay, so we're at both ends of the tubular system, okay? And it's going to be different on how it's reabsorbed. Let's look at the proximal convoluted tubule, where we said 65% of sodium is reabsorbed here. So we have the tubular fluid at the bottom of this picture. Okay, so this is going to be the tubular fluid down here. And we are going to have a relative high concentration of sodium in the tubular fluid. Okay. Now we're going to look at a couple different regions. We're going to look at tubular fluid, intracellular fluid, interstitial space, and then the blood vessel or the capillary. So the tubular fluid has a relative high level of sodium in relationship to intracellular sodium. So we're going to have a higher sodium here than we do in the intracellular space. Okay, so how sodium moves into the cell, so from the tubular fluid into the cell, just like anything else, is going to be through diffusion. Now here it's going to be facilitated diffusion, but in any case it still goes from high concentration down to a low concentration. So high concentration tubular fluid, low concentration of sodium intracellular. Sodium moves down its concentration gradient, and it's going to go through, you can see that little transport protein here. So the sodium is going to go through this channel and enter into the cell. Now we have to get rid of that sodium. So this is on the luminal surface, okay? Or the other word that we've always used in the past was apical, okay? But this is part of a lumen. The other side is your basolateral side, okay? And on the basolateral side, we are going to have sodium-potassium pumps, which is this thing, okay? Now that takes energy, and as a matter of fact, most of our energy with the transport portion of the kidney is taken up by these sodium-potassium pumps. And what this does, just like sodium-potassium pumps worked every place out, 3 sodium out, 2 potassium in. So the sodium comes from the inside where it's a relative high concentration, okay, because sodium's coming in here, or it's getting to be higher. So what we want to do is get rid of that sodium and move it out. So we're going to move it into the interstitial space, then that gets into your bloodstream. At the same time, potassium is going to come into the cell. Okay? Now, why do we do this? Okay? The reason we have a sodium-potassium pump is to keep the intracellular sodium ion level low. Okay? And that's going to tie directly into water reabsorption. But before we get into the water portion, let's look at the second picture here. Okay? And this is at the collecting tubules and collecting ducts, so it's at the other end. The same process exists, except the proteins on the proximal convoluted tubule versus the proteins over here. These are channels, these are transport proteins. Potato, okay? Sodium goes from tubular fluid into the cell. That's what we want to do here. If you want to go into cell biology, fine. Okay, there is a little difference there. You still have your sodium-potassium pump. That's still going to be the same. Okay, so sodium from the tubular fluid into the cell, sodium-potassium pump moves the sodium out of the cell, potassium in. Now, we're going to come back to potassium as our third element today, but notice let's just briefly talk about this, and then when we hit potassium, remember this. Potassium's coming into the cell. Now we got to get rid of it. There's going to be potassium channels that put potassium or secretes potassium into the tubular fluid. So the easy way of thinking of this, potassium moves opposite of sodium. So if you reabsorb sodium, you're going to secrete potassium. Okay, so if one level gets high, the other one typically gets low, and they kind of go back and forth. Okay, now what regulates, because I said before, the distal convoluted tubule, collecting duct varies on the amount of reabsorption. Okay, and the reason it varies is because the channels are are influenced by a couple hormones, and those are going to be influenced by aldosterone and atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP. Okay. Now, aldosterone and ANP both impact a specialized cell called a principal cell in the DCT, collecting tubule, and collecting duct. Okay. So that's where we're looking at this. And now what aldosterone does, aldosterone adds more of these channels on the luminal side, as well as adds more sodium-potassium pumps. So if we have more channels and more pumps, we can move more sodium. If you move more sodium, you absorb or reabsorb more sodium. Okay, and as such, you're going to indirectly get rid of potassium. Okay, atrial natriuretic peptide. So, okay, well, this is going to be principal cells. Principal cells, I'll say, adds sodium channels and sodium potassium pumps. So it's adding those, okay, on those. ANP inhibits reabsorption of sodium in the proximal convoluted tubule and collecting tubule. So that's inhibiting the reabsorption on this one. I don't know if I said earlier. Oh, yes, I did. I said it was 25%. Okay. So that's what we're looking at, sodium. Now let's look at potassium a little bit. Not potassium, water. What's going on with water in this case? Now, if we were looking at, I tell you what, I am going to erase a bunch of this junk just to clean it up. Okay. And let me erase this just to make it a little bit cleaner on what we're dealing with. Okay. So water, how does water get reabsorbed? Water, you've heard me say this in the past, water follows salt. Okay, water follows sodium. So if we have sodium leaving the tubular fluid and entering the cell, and thus entering the cell, and then it goes into this interstitial fluid, which then gets into your blood vessels, okay? So as we have an increasing level of sodium, then water is going to follow that. Now, water movement is based on osmosis, and how it moves is through paracellular. So if we have one cell here, water, so let me do water is going to go in between those cells, or we can have a little pore, which is over here on the other picture. It's called an aquaporin. Let me write that one out. An aquaporin is just a channel or a pore for water, okay? So if we have a higher concentration of sodium on this side, okay, water is going to move in that direction, okay? Now, I've said previously that, I'm going to ask that as a question on how much filtrate is formed and how much urine is formed, okay? So of water, I don't know if I covered that. Let me just see real quick. No, I did not. So of water, 65% is reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule, and it's more of an obligatory. So we have a constant or a relative constant number of aquaporins in which the water moves, and it's always going to follow salt. About 10% of water is reabsorbed, but only in the descending limb. Okay, what do I mean by descending limb? Okay, here's a picture of a nephron. Okay, now this is specific for potassium. Ignore the writing. Just look at the picture itself. Proximal convoluted tubule, so water is going to be 65% in the proximal convoluted tubule. Then we get into the nephron loop. This is your descending limb. This is your ascending limb, okay? So water, 10% of the water, so 10% of water is going to be reabsorbed from the descending limb only. The ascending limb and the distal convoluted tubules, so this side and this, is impermeable to water. Okay, so water's only going to come out of here. We're going to get that into a little bit more in a couple more videos on this one. Okay, then we have next thing we're going to talk about is the collecting tubule, and then the collecting duct is going to be that portion. Okay, now the collecting tubule and collecting duct, for water reabsorption, it's going to be controlled by aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone. Now, we've talked about aldosterone. It increases sodium reabsorption. If you increase sodium reabsorption, your water is going to follow that. Okay. Antidiuretic hormone is going to add aquaporins to these areas. So let me just change a little bit of a color. So it's going to add aquaporins in here, okay? So water is basically going to come through here. So it's impermeable to water unless you have the presence of antidiuretic hormone, in which case it opens up these pores, aquaporins, to let water out, because we're going to have a high sodium concentration in the interstitial spaces of that nephron, okay? Next up, I think we're looking at potassium. Let's see where we're at here. Potassium. Now, potassium is both, let me do here. So this one is, so let me go with black on here. Both reabsorbed and secreted. Okay? And the values differ. Now, when we're looking at potassium, 60 to 80% is going to be reabsorbed within the proximal convoluted tubule, and it's going to be through paracellular transport, okay? Paracellular, between the cells, but it is also going to be dependent on the movement of sodium. Okay, now think about this, okay? Put down your notes for a second and think. When we have sodium leaving the tubular fluid and it enters the cell, when it enters the cell, then it exits the cell on the basolateral surface. And so now we're going to have a higher concentration of sodium in the interstitial spaces, okay? Water follows that. This is everything we've discussed so far. As we remove water from the tubular fluid, so we're taking water out of the filtrate, can you visualize how that filtrate is becoming concentrated? Okay? If you remove water, then that fluid, the remaining fluid, is more concentrated. Now, with it being more concentrated, that's also saying we have a higher concentration percentage of potassium and other substances in the tubular fluid than we do on the interstitial spaces. So what happens is potassium diffuses down its concentration gradient from the tubular fluid into the interstitial spaces. And it moves to that interstitial space through paracellular transport, so it's in between the cells. So when sodium leaves, water leaves. When water leaves, this gets concentrated and potassium follows. Okay? Now, this is not just potassium. You're also looking at magnesium. You're looking at calcium. You're looking at phosphate, bicarb. All these other substances are moving down their concentration gradient as well. Okay? So potassium, about 10 to 20%, 10 to 20% is reabsorbed in the ascending thick part of the loop. So what do I mean by ascending? So ascending, here we go, 10 to 20%. So this is your thick part. So if you can see how thick this is versus this, okay, this is a much thicker area. That's what we refer to as the thick part. And this is going to be the thin part, okay? So potassium is only reabsorbed in the thick part of your ascending limb, okay? And it moves that way either paracellular wise, so in between the cells, or transcellular, so it absorbs one side and comes out the other. All right. Now, the collecting tubules and collecting ducts for potassium, what we're looking at are two different cell types associated with this area. We're looking at intercalated cells. So, here we go. So it's right. So type A intercalated cells, all right, those are continuously reabsorbing potassium. Is that, it's even saying it here. Reabsorb potassium continuously, okay? Principal cells, now remember we also talked principal cells on another area, but principal cells will secrete potassium based on your aldosterone levels. All right. Now, what did aldosterone do? Aldosterone added sodium channels, sodium-potassium pumps, and the purpose of adding those is so we can reabsorb more sodium. Well, if you reabsorb more sodium, what did we say down here? If you reabsorb sodium, potassium goes the other direction. Okay. What picture do we have here? This is just your water transport on here. Water coming from here, going through these aquaporins, coming through, or it goes in between the cells. That's all that was talking about on that one. Not a big deal, but you got a picture here so you can see this one. Okay. So intercalated cells, type A, reabsorb potassium continuously. Principal cells will secrete potassium based on your aldosterone levels. Okay. Now, your strongest factor that tells your adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone are going to be elevated potassium levels. Why is that? Okay, so if you have high levels of potassium, you want to get rid of that. Okay, you get rid of it because it's going to be just the opposite of here. So if you want to get rid of potassium, you have to reabsorb sodium. Okay, so that's it for those first three. Let me clean this up a little bit, and then we will go into those last 2 or 4 elements, depending on how we look at it. Thank you.